Good afternoon, and welcome once again to everyone who is joining us for the fourth panel of today's NAEC. This is the fourth of the four technical sessions that are holding in parallel, and it is my honor and privilege to be the convener of this panel. As most of us, realize, COVID-19 has created quite an unusual situation for us where we're having to adopt a mixed delivery mechanism approach to this conference. I thank you all for bearing with us and also with the technology backend. My name is Dr. Mutupe Adefeso Olateju, and I lead the team at the Education Partnership Center, TEP Center, and I'm a trustee of the Education Reform and Innovation team. Without further ado, I'm going to welcome our distinguished speakers who are joining us on this panel. I'm particularly excited because they are truly experts in the work that they do, and it is my honor and privilege to be able to welcome each and every single one of them to this meeting. In no particular order, except for the evidence holder who will join us presently, I believe. I will begin to share their bios or their designations so you know who they are. First is Dr. Rebecca Winthrop. Rebecca is a senior fellow and co-director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. We're also joined by Mr. Chinenye Mbauzoku, who is the CEO of Infographics Nigeria and a trustee of the Education Reform and Innovation team, ERIT. We're also joined on today's panel by Mr. Isa Abubakar, who is Director of Information and Communications Technology at the Federal Ministry of Education in Abuja, and Dr. Flora Adirogba, who is a consultant at UNICEF and retired from the Federal Ministry of Education as well. In addition, we're also being joined by Mr. Matthews Ngandiozo, who is Deputy Director, Statistics and National Education Management Information System, that is NEMIS, at the Federal Ministry of Education, by Mrs. Adebola Fashanu, who is Director, Right Seats Limited, a non-profit organization, and Mr. Mohammed Mahmoud, who is Technical Advisor to the Honorable Minister of Education. You are all welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we talk to her?
Okay, yes, you can talk. So thank you very much. Our colleagues who are joining us from Abuja, who are in person in Abuja, we see you. And may I crave your indulgence, if you're not speaking and you're able to mute the central microphone, that would be fantastic, as that would improve the audio quality. So thank you very much. What I would like to do very quickly is to set the context for today's conversation. The context is such that we all realize that we're living in a crisis. I think everyone realizes that by now. We focus quite heavily on the importance of evidence and data in the organization that I work with. And in doing some research, we have discovered that there have been significant shocks, to the education systems all around the world, and indeed severe disruptions to learning. We know now that almost 1.6 billion learners in over 190 countries and across all continents were affected by COVID-19. We also know that schools were closed and learning spaces have impacted up to 99% of children and other learners in developing countries. In addition, we know that almost 24 million additional children and youth from primary to tertiary levels may drop out or will not have access to school in 2021 due to the pandemic's economic impact alone. We also know that as at Q2 of 2020, 86% of children in primary education were effectively out of school in poorer countries, the lower economic countries with lower economic indices, as compared to only 20% in countries with higher economic indices. In Nigeria, 36.4 million children across primary and secondary schools were affected by school closures, and 40% of the total population, which is almost 83 million Nigerians live below the country's poverty line of about 377 naira per day, with severe implications for the ability to return to school in a country like Nigeria. Furthermore, if you have been following the news, you know that in the last month, we have had nationwide protests and indeed a period of what appeared to be civil unrest that underscored the importance of education and enlightenment and access to opportunity for Nigeria's teeming masses of youth. The reality is that there are broader systemic issues that either enable or hinder learning, but it is only within the context of a society that is able to reflect on what it is learning and is able to adapt measures of flexibility, that is able to innovate per time, that we can truly see development. And so today, we're focusing on how to foster a culture of innovation in education planning during and post-COVID-19. And we know that when we look at the data, digital innovations have been fundamental to countries' abilities to cope during the COVID-19 pandemic. And now with the likelihood of new breakouts of COVID, it is really important that as a country, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local government levels, and within the non-state sector, that we begin to place the concept of innovation front and center and make sure that innovation is truly at the core of our education policy planning, particularly as we think about crisis planning. Pertinent to the discussions today will be how to develop internal capacity to collect and reflect on data real time so that we can strengthen the evidence base upon which we make policy and improve the internal capacity to adapt to changing local and global contexts. We're also interested during this session in the connections and collaborations between sectors and agencies that result in concrete mid and long-term innovation strategies for enhancing the education sector. We know, again, that technology is going to continue to play an important role in how children learn, what they learn, and what they should learn. And so we're going to reflect on how it is that we can begin to think about embedding technology in a way that is meaningful for our country. And finally, given that research and development are really the bedrock of innovation, our conversations would also revolve around how we strengthen the competencies of institutions in Nigeria that are responsible for data collection and also responsible for thinking around our curriculum. So quite an exciting lineup of speakers, and also I think a most engaging topic that we are to reflect on today. Now, I just want to make sure that our Dr. Rebecca Winthrop, our guest speaker, is in. If she's not, we will commence the conversations immediately. And when she's able to join us, she will share her own thoughts as well. So is Dr. Winthrop here? Okay, so let's get into the meat of the matter. Okay, thank you very much for the feedback. Thank you for the feedback. So let's get into the meat of the matter. I would very much like to start with you, Mr. Chinenye Mbauzoku. The reality is that when we think about education in Nigeria today, we understand that the systems are not working optimally. If the systems were working optimally, we would not be in a situation where over 10 million Nigerian children are barred from education, do not have schooling places, and this is even before the pandemic. We would not have a situation where 55% of learners at grade 9 level are competent at the level of primary 2. Only 55% of them are competent at the level of primary 2 when it comes to foundational literacy skills. And we would also not be in a situation where we are unable to harvest the dividends of our democracy, where 2 out of 5 young people do not have prospects for employment in our country today. My first question to you is, what is the picture of the future that we should be painting? What is this desired future for Nigeria? What does it look like? And how do we begin to work backward to think about how that system can be developed? Because the vision is what propels the mission. And so the first step is creating that compelling picture and then working backward to understand what the levers are. And we will then take the conversation from there into how we begin to embed the principles of creativity, flexibility, and innovation that enable us to pivot into that desired future. So, Mr. Mbauzo, can I start with you?
Well, that's a huge question that you've asked. Yes, you can. And I guess that's a massive question that you've asked me. I don't know, I hope I can be heard well enough. And yeah, is it possible, perhaps I could start by maybe sharing a screen? Is that possible? Just to put things in context, I kind of like want to, I didn't plan to, but now that you ask a question, if something comes to mind, I think that sometimes things speak better for us than words, actually. So let me see if I can get this, to show. Right. So you asked what the picture was. I mean, painting the picture of the future always starts from your present. I mean, you need to understand really where you are, and the data you provided is really incredible. I always ask the question that if you don't dimension the challenge that you're facing, you cannot actually plan something that's successful into the future. Going by the data that we have, which estimates about 60% of our population as being youth, it literally means that we have about 120 million people who have to be in some form of education from early childhood all the way through to post-tertiary in workforce development. So every single day in this country, 120 million people need to be in some form of education or the other. And then we need to ask ourselves, so what kind of a system would do that? Because ultimately, in 1986, the world transited to a services economy, where the bulk of the population, bulk of the GDP that was being developed in the world leading economy, being the United States, the GDP was derived from these people who were not actually engaged in manual work like agriculture, engineering, manufacturing, et cetera, but rather had shifted dramatically to the services economy. That was 1986, and we're in the year 2020. The 21st century is not a century where you expect to go back into manual labor. On the contrary, you are going to find increasingly more and more of the work that is being done at that level being done by machines and systems that are automated, with human beings providing intellectual content to the process. Therefore, it's critical to understand that every nation competes today on the basis of its human capital. That's the single most important thing, your human capital. If we have a situation, I mean, when you read this, it says Africa will be the youngest continent on the planet between 2030 and 2050. And it says it will either be wrenched violently apart by the uncontainable forces of insecurity, plunging health, social dislocation, rural to urban surges, functional literacy, and a dysfunctional education system, an expanding digital divide and negative technology penetration, cybercrime, and other vices. There's nothing in this picture that isn't our reality today, and it's an unfortunate situation, but we have to plan for what next. And very quickly, I kind of like looking at the education system. We know these things. There's nothing new in all this. That is infrastructure decay. We know we have an issue around STEM. We know we have pedagogy and content issues, teacher issues, examination malpractices, and policy issues. But going forward, what do we need to understand? That the momentum, whether we want it to be so or not, there are certain things that will certainly happen. Knowledge is doubling every 5 years. And means that you cannot go through a 20 or 20, 30-year learning cycle that prepares you in year 10 for what's going to happen for the rest of your 20 years or 25 years of being active in the system. Lifelong learning is mandatory. And it's not just mandatory for one or two people, it's mandatory for the breadth. So when we have a system that starts really early to disenfranchise people in terms of their learning, then the learning loss you're referring to, the learning loss that has now become like topical because of COVID-19, we need to be able to understand what it means to have a learning loss that is compounded over decades of an education system that is not meeting the demands of its population. And this is why when we get to where we are today in the year 2020, the backlog of what has to be done, what has to be fixed is literally overwhelming. And it continues into the issues around the nature of the traditional education systems. Increasingly, we have found, as I said, that we've moved away from where it is just not academic knowledge now that's important, but we're moving into a place where technical competencies and skills have become absolutely important. And yet in that space, where after JS3, when approximately 84% of our children do not continue into senior secondary 1 because of the carrying capacity of the senior secondary system, have to drop off into technical education, and yet in that basking in terms of our capacity to actually uptake those young children as the years go by. So you see dropout rates, transition rates are dropping because limited capacity, dropout rates are rising fast. Children are not seeing the end result of their education, resulting in situations where there's a complete disillusionment or disconnection from the education system. And curriculum itself is changing at a pace that our policy is not catching up with. Then we go to the cost base of the traditional education systems, which are clearly unsustainable. And the best example of that perhaps is in the tertiary level. So at the tertiary level across Nigeria today, we have about 169 universities. And of these universities, and with a total gross enrollment of about 1.8 million, if we assume our population to be 200 million or even 183 million, that's 1% of our population. And yet today, we are caught in the context of how do we even fund that 1% of our population? How do we fund the education structures that are required to enable that 1% learn? But the data tells you clearly that the global benchmark for contribution of tertiary education to GDP is 8%. So literally what that means we need to get the number of enrollment in tertiary education to 10 million. To do that, you would simply be saying, you look at a University of Nigeria, you look at a University of Lagos, 70,000 students each, and you need to literally create 10 of them in every state in order to get to the number that you're requiring. That's not going to happen. We will never build the number of classrooms that are required, and we will never be able to get the number of teachers and infrastructure around these people that is required. So what does the future look like? If indeed we take these things as given and we want to build a future, then we must say to ourselves that there are some things that we will not go back to. We must make bold and big and disruptive decisions around the way that we are planning our education. And this is where innovation comes in. We have to embrace innovation, not just as a basis not just as a tick the box type of thing, but we need to embrace innovation as fundamental to driving the new models of education. What does the 21st century look like? It looks like where it's a picture of where you have 3 models for learning. You're going to have, of which the smallest is going to be the current model that we have. Education is going to either be completely online, or it's going to be online with a hybrid version, or it's going to be augmented residential. So 3 models. Augmented residential education, where for specific types of study, you need to have people on campus. Then you're going to have something else or in school. Then you're going to have something that is hybrid, where you literally more or less flip the classroom, and the children are learning online predominantly and coming into schools where it is convenient to learn in the schools what they cannot learn at home. And then you're going to have 100% online. But until we are ready to make those decisions, make those fundamental decisions that have to do with how we want the system to go forward, and those decisions are going to be really hard decisions, we will continue to oscillate between the 19th century model that we must get rid of and the 21st century model that the rest of the world has moved on to. And there is no middle space in between. And this is where we need to be able to say to ourselves, policy position, we are not doing the right thing. There is no way, for example, that a country can devote all its resources that would probably, with an education system as dilapidated as it currently is, and infrastructure has been neglected for decades, we are not going to be able to rebuild all those based on the 19th century model. We will not be able to do 10 unilags in Lagos to accommodate the 20 million people in Lagos state, and so on and so forth. What do we have to do? It's a hard decision. And here's where the rubber hits the road. We cannot have a situation where 2 million people, which is the 1.8 million students, plus the other 200,000 that probably constitutes partly academic and non-academic staff of the universities, have resources allocated to them, while the rest of the people in the pyramid have little or nothing. There must be a position where people shift and say, well, you know what? Yes, we should have done this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We didn't do it. What do we do now? We have to be planning a future and not planning a past. And for that purpose, people need to shift ground and say, well, okay, we don't have the infrastructure. So how does a university student go to university today? Up until about 2014, one university, the Indira Gandhi National Open University, had a student enrollment of 2.4 million. That is more than the entirety of our enrollment in all tertiary institutions in this country. And that was 6 years ago. So you cannot have a situation where, by contrast, our own National Open University is struggling to get to 1 million. So in summary, the situation is such that we need to do a wholesale, kind of like, it's not even a pivot. We just need to shift. It's a radical shift. And what will drive this is our ability to think innovatively around our challenges right now, accept certain things as given, and introduce not just the technology, but all the things that support technology, services, capability, pedagogy, curriculum, that allow us to rapidly scale. We cannot have 60 million children who are going into dysfunctional education structures and expect not to have food riots, expect not to have massive insecurity. We've got to find a way to constructively engage these children on an ongoing basis for as long as we possibly can, for them to be equipped and become productive citizens as is envisaged by the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those thoughts, Chinenye. And I think you've made some critical and foundational statements. And if I hear you correctly, one of the ways in which I will summarize your thoughts is that going into the future, we want every child to be in school and every child to be learning well. And we want the education that they receive to prepare them for a sustainable livelihood. And every other thing that we do within the system as it pertains to policy planning must revolve around the reality that that really is our focus, especially when we think about where the world is going and the excellent global context that you have set for us. Clearly, we do have a lot of work cut out for us. So thank you for that. I think I'm going to turn to Dr. Flora to extend this conversation, because sometimes there is a risk that when we're planning for the majority and not really thinking about the minority. But in Nigeria, I don't think it's really pragmatic for us to forget that minority, given that there's such a huge number. We know that there are millions of children in Nigeria today that are not in school. And Dr. Flora, part of your own specialization is really around exclusion. So when we think about exclusion from a gender perspective, and girls not having access, particularly in the northern parts of the country, sort of access to quality education that their male peers have. When we think about disabilities, and I think that the speaker from UNESCO made a very important point about us not having a national database that tells us how many of our children are actually visually impaired. And when we think about different types of physical and mental disability, and when we also think about children that are simply poor, and simply because of socio-economic factors, they cannot access high quality education, they cannot access education at all. It brings into very sharp focus how it is that we plan our policies. And so I would like you to share your own thoughts around exclusion. And to zero in on your own experience, you have peculiar experience, both in the institution of the Federal Ministry of Education and on the outside as a consultant for a development partner. What do we need to begin to do in terms of innovation to ensure that children that are currently excluded from the Commonwealth when it comes to education and learning can be brought back into the system? What needs to happen? Dr. Flora, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to appreciate the organizers of this conference. When I look at the sub-themes. I see that they are very rich and very current. These are issues that are affecting negatively the education sector in this country. And these are the issues on the table for us now to discuss. So what we are here to discuss, or what I believe we should discuss, is not just a theory, academic exercise. It's an exercise that should face the, what obtains in the Nigerian context. Now, you've asked me to speak on the issue of inclusiveness. Good enough. The GMR for 2020 emphasizes inclusiveness, that all means all children must be in school. And the ministerial strategic plan, the first focus is the issue of access. How do we get all these children in school? Now, like you said, the issue of exclusiveness became very prominent during this COVID-19, during the lockdown, whereby so many children were not able to go to school. What I observe is that there are some children, category of children, excluded during this lockdown. These are children with special needs, children that are vulnerable, children that come from the low economic quintile, who cannot have access to online education because it's either they lack the technology or the infrastructure is not available. These are issues that we should address. And then we have to address the issue of data, the issue of policy. Because if we don't have the correct data of children who are outside, then we will not be able to plan for them. We have out-of-school children. We are being told that there are between 11 and 14 million in Nigeria alone. How true is that? We don't know. But it is correct that we have some children on the streets. Then we have children in hard-to-reach areas in this country. If anyone has had the opportunity of going out for monitoring, you will find out that there are settlements on hills, there are settlements across rivers that you have to fly on the boat before you can get there, maybe 1 hour, 2 hours. These children, this category of children are being excluded. They are being excluded, even in the conventional schooling, they are being excluded. It appears that we're just focusing our lenses on children in the urban areas. Those in the rural areas, they don't have the opportunity to learning, and not only to learn, to just going to school, but quality learning, because the issue of the quality of teachers matters. That's why I'm so happy we are dealing with curriculum, we are dealing with infrastructure, we are dealing with teachers at this conference. Now, in this group panel 4, we are dealing with planning. Planning is at the core of everything. If you are able to articulate issues on curriculum, on teacher quality, on the number of children wherever, and you don't plan for them, you are not going to achieve anything. There is a saying that fail to plan, plan to fail. There is another that I usually say, if you plan and you fail to implement, then you will harvest nil results. And the whole essence of anything we are doing is to get results. If you plan for anything and you don't get results, you have not achieved. So this panel will just be like a harvester, harvesting the innovations in curriculum, in teacher education, in infrastructure. Then you infuse it into the plan. That is how we can be sure that we will not exclude some children. And we need data, quality data, the actual data. The sorry case in this country is that when you go to school, you find out that at times they have data for the federal, they have data for the inspectors when they come, they have data for this and that. They don't have one type of data that will serve every purpose that comes to the school. So you have different types in the school. This should be discouraged. It should be discouraged. And it is very important for us, if we want to have the whole picture, to have a very good EMIS, strengthened with the necessary innovations in terms of technology, in terms of competence of staff in that whether unit now or division or whatever. So it is very important. So what we the issue of exclusiveness has to be addressed, because there are so many children with special needs, children who cannot hear. There was a Zoom meeting maybe during when they were doing the girl child whatever. I asked that question on the chat. I said, we are talking about children, the normal children. What about children with disabilities? What about children, vulnerable children, who don't fall within any family category of benefiting either from the physical, the face-to-face learning in classrooms or the online ones? We have so many of them. And these are the ones who grow up to become a big menace to the society. So if we have to come out of insecurity, come out of these issues of, that are affecting us negatively in the country, we really have to deal with the issue of access to every child. Said, leave no child behind. I think that was the GMR for 2019. Am I right? Okay. So this year is, have I had my time? Am I done?
You're rounding, I think you're rounding off.
Yes, I'm rounding up. So we have to look at those reports, the GMR, which is telling us that we should not leave any child behind, which means there should be no exclusiveness anywhere. Everybody should be included. 100% inclusiveness of those who can hear, those who cannot talk, those who are mentally retarded. They are children, and they have that right to education. It's their fundamental human right to education. We all have rights to education. So let me just round up by saying that we should, enough to just talk short. Talking, and talking without action. There should be action that should be measurable. There should be action that should adhere to the plan. The education sector should have a plan, and we should follow that plan, so that all the key performance indicators are put there, the targets, our targets, and we must be able to track all these things through the monitoring and evaluation mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flora. I particularly appreciate your emphasis on moving from just talking to actual implementation. I'm excited that the Federal Ministry of Education is putting in place an implementation strategy. And I would strongly urge, all of us that have been involved in this conference to be interested in that, and also to participate and make sure that we can truly bring to life some of the conversations that we've had today and what we deliberate upon. Thank you for that perspective. But I want to touch on a point that you made about MS, because MS is critical. Well, the Education Management Information System determines, how much information is available to us to make policies for the purpose of practice. And here with us we have Mr. Matthews, who's the head of MS, the national MS at the Federal Ministry of Education. And Mr. Matthews, we've had a conversation, haven't we? Around the conceptual framework for education data collection in Nigeria. We know that it's currently undergoing a review. We know that you're working very hard to review and update that. But I think that the persons that are participating in this panel would really benefit from understanding how it is that data is collected in Nigeria. And we know that there are annual school censuses that are supposed to be administered every year, and every state is supposed to participate in this. But where are your pinpoints when it comes to this system? Where are your pinpoints? Where are the challenges? And what is being done to address some of the challenges around the collection of data? I also note that if you go on the Federal Ministry of Education website, there is substantially more data there than there has been in quite a few years. And I think that's commendable. But the question again is, to what extent is that data usable for those who need to make critical decisions, for those who want to do research? So it's really a question around the education management information systems. I think people would really appreciate understanding how the data from the states connects and how that data interlinks at the national level, and how it is that data is even made available for use for all those that need to access the data. Mr. Matthews?
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers, as you said earlier, for the conference. Yes, coming to the issue of data, education management information system. Well, many times people say we don't have data. We have enough data. We have up to 2019 data provisional, and 2020 data for Federal Ministry of Education, of course, the whole Nigeria, that's the states as well, under annual school census, as well as other secondary data is in progress. As you said, without data, you can't plan well. During the COVID-19 issue, when the schools were closed down by March, the next thing people were asked, what do we do? How do we move ahead in terms of educational attainment, in terms of delivery in education? I remember states were doing one thing or the other, and people don't know what the states were doing. NAEC swung into action to contact all the states to know where are they, what actually doing in terms of the deliberability of how to train our children within that period of COVID. If you go to education website, a director ICT is here. NAEC was able to quickly go around all the states. We didn't move out. We sat in our seat and get all the states. As we are here now, if you want all the states here, we can call them and they will respond. So we're able to get it. And then finally, if you can get by the end of that exercise, almost all the states participated, and we have 100% of the states in terms of what they are doing in various places concerning the training or e-learning during the period of COVID. Some have various timetables in terms of the basic education. Some also have for the post-basic education. Some did it in various ways. They first of all started with the examination classes of JS3 and SS3 as well as primary 6, and they were able to go. We have all of them in the website. After that, we went further. Even the last conference, Education Management Information System, which was held at Makurdi in 2019, all the states were there. And what we deliberate in the conference, how do we move education sector forward in terms of education data? And everything about education data in Nigeria, starting from annual school census, every state we work together in terms of the instrument is a national instrument. And within that conference, it was approved that national software, which is NAEC software, should come up for us to have online data collection. I want to be bold to make it now that yesterday we were able to test that software with all the IDPs after testing it with the states through visual training. And by next week, UNESCO is also funding some states, about 10 states, to go physically and be trained on that. As I'm talking now, Gombe is already collecting data. During that visual meeting yesterday, the data that Gombe is collecting using the software, we were able to assess it and see how much they have collected. So actually, Nigeria Education Management Information System, which is holistic for the system in terms of Nigeria as a whole, we are poised to make sure that we have current data and then, of course, credible data. With the software coming up, the issue of people talking about various registers in the state will be over, because it's online and the real-time data capturing for every state. And immediately they capture, as a state is capturing, that state will not know what another state is doing, because every state has their own pattern in that software. But as a full administrator, we should be able to organize and then get a report from there. When we are talking about out-of-school children, yes, out-of-school children in Nigeria as of 2018, we have it as 1.193 million, 10.193 million, and that remains. Then during the COVID, we are yet to have a comprehensive exercise so that we can now know how we are. Because during that time, a lot of things were going on in the country to see how the out-of-school children should be reduced. And that brought the issue of BESDA. In 17 states, we have BESDA, where they are seeing how to bring back the out-of-school children to school, the girls back to school, and others, and also supporting annual school census generally for all the states, so that with that, we can still see that issue of data is being addressed. So by the time, at the end of the exercise, we should be able to now know where we are, how many have gone back to school. Many states are reporting how many they've been able to bring back to school by what BESDA is giving them to make sure they do. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we have provisional data for 2019. And then for 2019 as provisional data, we have 119,532 primary schools right now, with population of, that's enrollment of 28,669,206. That is provisional because we're still working on that. As well as for the junior secondary, which is 7.229138 million, and that of the senior secondary, which is 5,382,850. And when you look at it in comparison with that of 2018, there is an advancement, there's improvement in terms of the formal data. So actually, the NAEC is working to see that we provide necessary data for there to be planning. It's not only for basic or post-basic education data. When we talk of Nigeria Digest of Education Statistics, it's holistic for education sector. We talk of the universities, polytechnics. Of course, we call them secondary data because we collect such data for university, NUC, for polytechnic, MBTE, and exam bodies, as well as other agencies. But the problem at times we have is that these agencies still have problem on their side. When they are not collecting their data, we cannot. In most of our publications, when you look at it, you see that most of these agencies, the data we publish for them may be 2 years behind because they have not done actually the data collection. But with what we are talking about, the new NAEC software, one of the deliverables in that software is at the end of exercise, once stabilized with the annual school census, which is the basic and post-basic, we now go further into what we call program application program interface to connect other universities, other levels of education, so that we will be one place and the data will flow in. But I must point that in as much as the system is helping at the federal as much as possible, most of the states are not doing what is expected to be done. Most of the states, what they have in their budget for MEs, they use it for another thing, which means a problem. And in such case, they cannot give us the data. And that comes out to what we call orphan states and normal states. Those states that are supported by IDPs that are called the normal states, but the orphan states are those that don't have anybody supporting them, except their budgetary provision. And other than the budgetary provision, many of them don't even utilize it, they use it for other things. So I think this conference should address such to see how one of the deliverables should be that the states should do the right thing in terms of data collection by utilizing the fund meant for it, apart from the other people assisting them. And also the development partner should, as much as possible, find it necessary to do it for the whole system. Because we cannot report Nigerian data for 10 states, it's not possible. Or 20 states, it's not possible. We have to have it holistic. So when the system and others are not assisted, it means that at the end, Nigeria may not be able to complete the reporting of this data.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matthews. I think you've helped us realize that there seems to be quite a bit of traction around moving us from perhaps a slightly archaic system to one that is more nimble, and one that is more innovative, and one that is able to offer us hope that data will be captured, more frequently. However, I think the reality is that how you capture data is one thing. How you design the data capture is another. And so what sort of information are we even collecting? I know that in recent time, there's been a renewed emphasis on being able to identify the children whose data we are collecting. The whole issue of the national ID system, and questions are being asked. Even I see even in the chat box, on YouTube, that there are even questions around why can we not link, the annual school census to learning achievement data? In which case we can then begin to tell, which child, is performing to what degree. We can begin to link learning outcomes to school infrastructure. We can begin to link learning outcomes to teacher capacity. These systems are not difficult to implement. But I'm going to bring in Mr. Mohammed at this point, Mahmoud, because I know that you have a passion when it comes to national ID, and have expressed a bit of frustration, with our seeming delay in being able to capture this important data around who our population is, and therefore we struggle with how to plan for them. I'd really like to hear your own reflections on how it is that we can, in the first instance, make data collection cultural. So Mr. Matthew has talked about, orphan states. These are states that don't have any external support, for the collection of data. And he said that some of these states actually use their EMIS budget, for other things. But how do we make data collection cultural? How do we also think about joined up processes such that different institutions, different agencies and organizations can collaborate to ensure that we have not just data, but data that is useful, data that is meaningful, and data that is recent? I'd really appreciate you to share your own perspectives on that, Mr.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much, Mo. And I think looking at the conversation so far, it has, of course, naturally come down to data. And 4 years ago, no, 5 now, I told my boss, the Honorable Minister, that when I got in and I did a quick analysis, and I was reporting to him my first month, and I said, "Sir, you have 3 problems. Number 1, data. Number 2, data. Number 3, data." That's what I said. It may look like I'm disagreeing with my friend before, Matthews, but that's not the case, really, because the point here is, I think Mo mentioned, Chineye talked about the structure we're getting to. So I had a lot to say on that, but I'll stick to data for the meantime. The issue we have is the veracity of this data, because having data is one thing. You agreeing with what you have and believing in it is one thing, but everybody else saying, yes, we believe your data, is totally an entirely different thing. I went for a conference, a course actually, in South Korea 4 years ago, and I called home and asked for this, the number of primary schools in Nigeria. I was going to do a presentation. We're being honest. We're in the family here. Yeah. So I called the head of the office. I called 3 different departments. I got 3 different figures for the same data set. Okay, so I want us to be honest because look, it's one thing to have that passion. I've known Matthews for so long. He's been doing this for a long time. And I know that he's one of the first places I visited and we spent a lot of time was his office. So I know because of the passion I have for the data. Now, the reality is, unless we get to that point where Chineye talked about reformatting everything. And I've noted, and I was going to talk about it, so I don't have to, because Chinenye has mentioned a lot of this, learning delivery reformatting. We have to talk about technology access. We have to talk about device provisioning, infrastructure repurposing. You know, for instance, the three options he gave. How do we now implement it? What we have, where we're trying to build more classrooms? How do we now change and look at the money and say, no, we don't need this money for more classrooms. We need it for maybe a bigger hall, because we're only coming in once a week or twice a week. Okay. Another example is the National Open University. If I'm not mistaken, the National Open University last year got 400,000 students, of which roughly 250,000 are active. So the example of what is happening in India is actually quite workable here. So the question for the FME is, how do we now look at the success story of the National Open University and replicate, because that's what we need to do. That's what we need to do. So the infrastructure thing, the funding, TED Fund, very specific. Laws tell us this is what TED Fund is for. You have to change these things, because if a certain percentage of TED Fund funds are for building classrooms, and it's very specific, you have to change that. If you don't change that, you're going to be building classrooms while what we really need is to give money to Director ICT to give us more tablets. Yeah? Okay, so coming back to the data part, the veracity has to be established in the sense that when Matthews says there are 10 million.1 XYZ, everybody believes that figure. Nobody has an issue with that. In fact, if anybody has an issue with that, he can now get back to Matthew and they argue it out. But nobody's going to say, no, we don't believe it because UNESCO says it's 13 million. Yeah, and you say it actually said it's 14 million. Doctor, you said it's anything between 11 and, yeah. So clearly we do not have that veracity that we need. We need the veracity because you cannot plan with a range. Some 30 years ago, I was listening to local news, and a minister for water resources was talking on air, and he said, he's the minister of water resources, can't remember who it was, and he said, we have about, and he mentioned a number of dams in Nigeria. And I said to myself, wait a minute, are the dams moving around so that we cannot count them? Are they moving around? Okay, the point here is data is so important that if we do not know where our water sources are, we definitely have a problem. Now, if we're talking about education and children, and I talked to the Director General of NIMC, and he told me that 52% of the Nigerian population is under 25, which is the school going age. Yeah, correct? So if half of us plus 2 need this service, definitely it means we have to work where.
Please, you go for lunch.
Yeah,
they want to stop.
This is more important than
Of course, it's more important. It's so
Okay.
online.
Yeah. Sorry for the online. We were interrupted because of a call to lunch. So I'll try to wrap up because unlike virtual people, we have to eat. I know. So, but but the point is. I think we have to really have a very important, honest discussion about data. Not just touching it and going away and saying, okay, let's fix 1 or 2 things and then go away. Because the reality is, I said this some time ago also to one of the heads of a committee that the Honorable Minister set up. And I said, look, even if you succeed, how do you know you have succeeded if you don't have a baseline? How do you tell? How do you know? Okay, so if you look at, I'll give an exercise on this. You look at the local news and you hear, don't quote my boss, by the way, but people talk about figures and they say, we have about, we have around. We have to be able to say very, very specific things. School buildings do not move. They are in specific longitudes and latitudes. That cannot be rocket science to put down together and say we have X amount of classrooms. That means we need to build X, Y, Z, and so on. So I'll stop here because otherwise I'll be ranting in a while. Thank you very much.
I think we would appreciate even your rants, Mr. Mahmood, because your rants do make a lot of sense. Your words are very, very valuable. Thank you so much for those reflections. Before I go on to the next speaker, I just wanted to crave your indulgence for us to achieve consensus, also with those who are joining us virtually. If we can carry on with the session up until about 4:15. And then you can have your delayed lunch. I hope no one has major objections to that.
I think we'll have to meet the organizers and confirm that. So that
the organizers are happy. The organizers are happy for us to do that. I've had a conversation.
Okay. I'll have to confirm that.
No, what?
Yes, I've had a conversation. I think that the discussion is so rich that it'd be a real shame to interrupt it right now for temporary pleasure of lunch. Even though I do understand, of course, that lunch is really important to have. But we're getting somewhere. And in terms of the process flow, we're going to also hear the perspectives of the director of ICT, because a lot of this responsibility sits with him and his office. You know, when we think about, technology, when we think about data, when we think about, pivoting, it's important to hear his own perspectives on what it is that the ministry is doing right now and where the ministry is actually going. And then it's also very important to hear, from the perspective of a person that works every single day with children. She has worked with children who have, been underserved, children who are struggling at this point in time to access any kind of meaningful, education, so that we can really bring into sharp focus the importance of our conversations to children around the country. We also have Dr. Rebecca, who is going to come in with a presentation, but a very brief presentation, to take us out of the Nigerian context into the international context. And then we can come back for just about 15 to 20 minutes and agree what the key action points are going to be, which will feed into an implementation strategy after this meeting. So I think that we have a really nice flow going, and if it's all right, I would crave your indulgence for us to carry on for just a little over an hour and come to a conclusion that we're all happy with. Does that sound all right?
Director ICT was.
Thank you so much. So, Director ICT, Madam, you're welcome. Okay, Madam, you're welcome. We would very much like your very brief reflections on what you're hearing. We're hearing that technology is the future. We're also hearing that we're majorly incapacitated, when it comes to the education sector, to be able to deploy technology at the current time to help us access the sort of data that we need to make decisions. Where does your work as ICT sit in all of this? And where is that work going? What is the future looking like? What sort of innovations and what sort of strategies are you putting in place right now? Malam?
Thank you for having me and thank you for inviting me. But I will digress a little bit. I think we have this notion of we must have brick walls to study. I think that is where we are getting it wrong in terms of our perspective to education. Can we independently think, how do we get our kids educated? And what solution will work for us? Do we have to build classrooms? Do everybody have to go to university? What is education to us? What does education mean to us? If we begin to reflect on that, then maybe we can come up with a solution that will work for us. But if all we are thinking is to fit into the so-called international community by X number of people have to be out of school, X number of people have to go to classroom, they have to go from primary school to secondary school to university, then I think we have a problem because we do not have an economy that supports that. And that's how we end up with so many graduates that we can't find a job for. Yeah. If in 21st century you go to university and read, with all due sense of humility, political science, where do you get a job? Those are realities we have to talk to. Now, coming to education data, We're in a time now that we have all the electronic computers, equipment that we can actually get a unique, reliable, verifiable data. But we need to sit down and, like Mr. Mahmoud said, decide how do we want to get this data and how do we want to use it. I've discussed with Mr. Matthew severally. How do we make this data reliable and acceptable to everybody? Can we sit down and research and say, okay, this is the basic, this is the fundamental of what we are going to, of how we are going to gather our data? For instance, we know all the schools in Nigeria, primary schools in Nigeria. That's no rocket science. And if we know them and we have them in a sequence and in a system like we currently have in our website, attaching number of pupils in every class is not a rocket science. Attaching number of classrooms to those schools is not rocket science. Number of toilets, number of teachers. If we have this fixed data, annual addition of data to this shouldn't be an issue. And these are things that can be verified. But why can't we sit down and why do we have to wait for states to give us data that we know are not reliable? And what we are trying to do in the ministry going forward is develop a standard basic starting point. We have all the list of primary schools and secondary schools in Nigeria. We have their geolocation. That will be a starting point. The next thing will be, let's add up the number of classes each of this school has. Like Mahmoud said, they won't move. If there are any addition to those classrooms, it was a shame during the COVID. I was approached by Minister of Health. They wanted the data of schools that have boarding facilities nationwide. I can only give them that of federal government colleges. Because the idea with them was that if COVID got out of hand, they wanted to be sure they have boarding school in every community that can isolate students, isolate pupils. And we didn't have those kind of data. But if we decide that, okay, first and foremost, like I said earlier, let's have the record of all the schools in Nigeria. Let's have the record of their location, which we know. Let's have the location of number of classrooms they have, number of teachers. Once we build these fundamentals, adding up annually shouldn't be an issue. And we can make a point, like I also did a presentation yesterday to management. 15 December of every year, let's have the data for the previous year. Because by then, everybody has finished admission, everybody has finished movement, and there can be consequence to it. Once we can define this baseline, and that's what the ministry is working towards, I have people to submit to the HME and proposing this. 15th of every month of January of every year, every state should submit its data for that year. And once we begin to build a progressive data, we're able to check out how many people dropped out. Why is there a sharp increase in number of enrollment in a particular community? For instance, the data I have on my website that's going to come live sometime next week, you will see a sharp drop between primary 6 and JS1. Maybe almost about 50%. Did they all die? Did they all choose not to go to school? So we need to be able to build something, and I think the ministry is going towards building something that will be acceptable by everybody. And once we have that, then we can begin to talk of access to education, who are most vulnerable, how do we really get to them? And we can even begin to have identity for our students. As a student, once you enroll into a primary school, you should have an identity that will, just like a bank account. Your bank account, once you have it, is attached to you. So what can we have an identity that shows state code that identifies the state, local government code, or the number of the state school code in that state, and then slash your number. Anywhere you go, we knew that you were in Niger State, Agay local government, and this is your number. And that can identify the school you attend, even up to graduation. So as far as we are concerned, once it has to do with education, that's your education identity. As you get older, we can tie it to your need. That way we begin to.
So, Doctor.
Thank you.
So, Malam, I guess I do have a follow-up question for you, because the point you make is a very important one. What is the challenge with making this happen? What is stopping us from having this identity system for children so that we can begin to address it that particular stumbling block?
It's not really, well, it's our thoughts, we're sharpening it. Myself, Nemis and Co are coming to an understanding. I'm just a nomad in education. I met them doing a system, and they have their own culture. So we need to sit down with all of them to understand that with the available technology, with technology available to us now, we can design this system without any additional stress. And I guess we're almost there. And I'm hopeful that by next year, we'll have built that kind of system such that going further, we'll have a reliable database.
I think that is fantastic. Personally, I think that gives me a lot of hope. I really hope for those of us who are joining remotely, that gives us a lot of hope as well. You know, that in the very near future, we could have an education management information system and indeed a set of technology platforms that help us to harness the sort of data that is meaningful for policy making. Thank you very much for that, Madam Isa. I'm going to turn very, very quickly to I think it's important that you a humane picture of why we need to prioritize what we're talking about. It's easy to talk at the macro level about the structures that we need to put into place, but the reality is that every single day, children are being walked into a system that is not working for them. And I'd really appreciate it if you could reflect on what you are learning as a person who works with children who are disadvantaged, who work with teachers who are struggling at this point in time. What should the priority of the government be right now when we think about innovation to enable children to learn and learn well? So, Mrs. Adebola Fashanu.
Good afternoon, Doctor. It's indeed a pleasure to be in this very robust panel.
I'm sorry, before you carry on, please can the tech team let Dr. Rebecca into the show because she's about to make her presentation as well. Thank you. So, Mrs. Adebola Fashanu, the floor is yours. We can't hear you.
Yes, it's a pleasure being in this panel. When we talk about fostering a culture of innovation, we have to also look at the children who are the beneficiaries of this innovation that we're proposing. And by my virtue of my interactions with children and young persons, from indigent children, educated children from indigent backgrounds, children from educated backgrounds, we discovered that this generation of children we have now, who fall in the group of Generation Z, they have something in common, no matter their background. They have some certain traits in common. And some of them, just for emphasis, is that they are very, very comfortable with technology. Right from a very early age. I'll give an example. I was at the market the other day buying something, and the trader's child woke up and she saw me and he noticed my Fitbit. And this 3-year-old, he just kept on trying to fiddle with it. And then I touched it and the light came up and immediately he began to press on the screen. How he knows it's a touch screen. So they're very, very comfortable with technology. They're very, very comfortable with their gadgets. They're very, very comfortable with their gadgets. They're very, very, irrespective of their social background, even children of illiterates, once their parents have a phone that they can access, even children of some of us who are not that illiterate, the things we do on our phone are very limited. Let your grandchild handle your phone. You wonder how they know about it, because this is their reality. This is their culture. These are children that were born into they were born into technology. Most of us here were hybrid, we are part analog, part tech. In fact, most of us were struggling to be compliant. But that is their reality. So when we're talking about policies to be made, we have to understand where they're coming from. For example, the average adult feels that a young person just plays around with their phones. when they have it. Even when I have interactions with teachers and things, they say, no, it's a distraction. They're just playing with it. And I tell them that when the purpose of something is unknown, abuse is inevitable. If you do not understand that this tool can be used as an educational gadget to engage the child will just think it's a toy. This generation, they don't like too much talking. If you notice, there was a young student sitting here. He's supposed to observe and listen. He was sleeping. He was gone until he was taken out for lunch. They are easily bored, but they get engaged handling apps. A few years ago, yes, the government supplied computers to schools and stuff. But you discover that these children, they'll tell you that, oh, they were just locked up in the store. They didn't have access to it. And even as we are talking now, these children have gone beyond the stage of desktop. They're into tabs, Android phones, iPhones, and the apps, various apps, available. So when we're talking about culture, culture is has to do with values and norms of a people or an organization. And these values and norms affect our attitude. And this is where capacity training comes in. When you're teaching, when we're training the trainers have to be made to understand that these children, this is the way their mindset works. How do we work things out in a way that the teachers will be well equipped to teach or train these children in a way that will engage their attention? Technology has come to stay, whether we like it or not. I remember donkey years ago when I was still in the service and we had to be trained on how to use computers. In fact, most of us were terrified of it, not knowing that that was even just the beginning. But we took the bold step and began to learn typing with one finger because we are used to typing with typewriters and things, not knowing that even within the near future we're going to start using tabs. This phone is like my mobile office. Everything I can work on it from anywhere and go anywhere. So when we're talking of, because I want to focus on capacity development of teachers, we have to work on our mindset. We have this mindset that phones are toys. Not even only teachers, even parents, we have this mindset that phones are toys, that they are a distraction to these children. But they're not a distraction. They only become a distraction when we don't utilize them. There are so many educational apps that children can access on the phone. And I'm even talking about once a child has a phone, whatever the background, the average Nigerian has a phone. Even our drivers, the guards, everybody, most of them have a phone. And the children just access them and start. So when our teachers have been trained, we have to change our attitude and our norms to accommodate the attitudes and norms of these present children that we are trying to teach in such a way that we will capture their attention. Not that they'll be teaching and half of them are asleep. Why are they asleep? They're asleep because they're not being challenged enough by what they have been taught or the way they have been taught. They're not being engaged enough. They're not being interactive enough. With technology now, there are so many different things that you can use to get them engaged. How the government can incorporate this into the policies it makes, it's very important. And one of it is learning and relearning. The teachers have to relearn and begin to see education through the eyes of this generation that they're teaching. There's no way you can put old wine in new skin or new wine in old skin. It will burst because it will expand. So that's just basically what I'm all about. Yes.
Thank you so much for that. I think that one of the most important points that I'm hearing you say is that there needs to be a mindset. And so when we think about technology, we have to think not just from the perspective of the learner, but also from the perspective of the teacher, so that we don't continue to have those gaps or those divides in their own appreciation for tech tools and in their capacity to use them as well. So thank you very much for those reflections, and I really appreciate it. Rebecca, welcome. I did introductions earlier on. I'm sorry that there was a bit of a challenge with the tech, but it's wonderful to have you here. Rebecca, once again, is our evidence holder for this session. She's Dr. Winthrop, and she is the Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution in DC. And we've had quite an interesting conversation around the importance of innovation. That has naturally taken us into the importance of data, and then the sort of structures and systems that enable a system that learns through data. We've spoken about information and communications technology. We've talked about accountability and transparency, and we've talked about the what of data and also the power of data collection systems. And we would very much like to hear, from the international perspective, especially, what we should be reflecting on and thinking about as we move forward as a country, about innovation, embedding innovation into how we plan education. What are the opportunities for us to learn? What is the best practice out there? And what are the opportunities for us to move forward? So, Rebecca, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me fine? Okay, great. And greetings to everybody, distinguished guests, and I'm so sorry for my technological problems. I must admit that I have a very hard time hearing you all. It sounds underwater, but at least I'm in. And if you can hear me, I'll just carry forth. And I got a sense of it. I got a flavor of the discussion. Is that okay?
Yes,
yeah, we can hear you.
You can. Oh, good.
If your YouTube is on, you might want to maybe put that off, and then the audio may improve.
Okay,
I think everyone will probably put their YouTubes off.
I put my YouTube off also.
Great.
I think I'm just having, I don't know,
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Mo, I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen. Is that okay? Okay, so I think I just click here for share screen. Okay, what do?
You select application window.
Got it.
Yeah.
There we go. And then I think I just do. You tell me if it's working. Do you see me and the screen?
Not yet. So if you click the share screen, it pulls up a menu. You see application window. Then you select the one that you want.
Yep. It's up on my side, and is it up over there yet? Oops. Is it coming up over there, or is it still not working?
It's not up here.
So maybe somebody on the tech team might need to give additional permissions.
Yes, because I've shared it on my side, and
I think it might be coming up.
Yeah. Okay, let me know.
Okay.
And as we're working on the technology, I just wanted to frame a little bit. We are a center in Washington, D.C., as the introduction clearly stated. We do look at education around the globe. Did it come up?
Brilliant. We can see it. Future of education.
Great. Perfect. Okay. So yes, we're good to go, and I should start. Hello? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
We can see your slides. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. So I'm going to be sharing with you some of the insights that we have been thinking about and researching. And our job, our existence is we are a research to practice organization. So doing independent research, we're nonpartisan. We have a large network of scholars and practitioners who work with us around the globe. including in Nigeria with Judith Ann Walker up in the north, who's part of a non-resident scholar with us, etc. And we do independent research. We translate our research into tools. We do quite a bit of advising. We do convenings. So what I'm going to be sharing with you now is some thoughts on education innovation, especially coming out of a crisis and amid crisis. And we've been working on this topic for the last several years. And they're very macro, big picture. They take a very big picture global view. I am not an expert in education in Nigeria, but all of you are. So I leave you to make the connections as you see fit. So first and foremost, this is just a little preview. We really feel quite strongly that a crisis is terrible in many, many ways. But if you look for it, there is always opportunity for transformation out of crisis. And in some ways, a crisis helps push forward innovation and the adoption and openness to innovation, because as the previous speakers were, I believe, saying, the world is changing and change can be hard to move forward, but a crisis allows for that. These are some of the reports that I'm going to be giving you a summary over in the next few minutes. So this is something that you know very well for Nigeria. Before, there was, as people said before, there was a crisis before COVID on education inequality. This is pre-COVID numbers. These are global numbers. About half of all the entire youth population in the world, 900 million youth, the vast majority of whom are in low and middle income countries, won't have the full set of skills, literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, and problem solving at the secondary education level by the time they reach adulthood. And we've got 10 years, it's urgent, and COVID only makes this worse. We did quite a bit of research showing several years ago that there was this 100-year gap between the richest children catching up to the educational levels, both in years of schooling and literacy and numeracy learning, to the poorest children catching up to the richest children. It takes on average gross big predictions. It's not 100 years in every single country, but more or less in most countries. There's some exceptions in Scandinavia. I'll give you would have your own examples in Nigeria, but certainly from the United States, we have deep education inequality, and it's going to take 126 years for kids in the first grades of school, the poorest kids, to catch up to the richest kids. So this is a universal problem, and COVID has made it worse. I mean, it is drastically worse. And the reason, and I just want to double down on this, you all know this, you're all committed and working heavily on education, but education inequality is terrible. It's a disease. It causes many more problems than just a particular child or family not having a full potential to live their lives and have the opportunities they need. It causes societal problems. There's deep economic consequences. There's a lot of research that shows that education inequality increases the risk of conflict, basically civil conflict. And it's education inequality, not low levels of education. So when there's low levels of education and everybody has the same low levels of education, it doesn't increase risk of conflict. When there's deep inequality in some pockets, whether they be rural or ethnic minorities, don't have access to good education, and some pockets, whether they be urban and wealthy or something like that, do, that's where you get grievances and big risks. So it's really essential to for the whole country, for a nation to tackle education inequality for their own sort of well-being as a country. The other thing I want to say is that we know education inequality of the existing systems, what education has to deliver today, is one piece of what we're facing. I heard a little bit, as I was able to get in and out of some of the sessions, I heard a little bit people talking about, technology has changed. We're now using our iPhones as our desktops. We need to make sure that kids have the 21st century skills, or you can call them whatever you want, but they're the skills that employers need for a future of work in a digital world, in a world of technology, in a world of complex social problems. They're citizenship skills, and strong academic rigor is a foundation, but by no means the totality of what skills children need. They really need learning how to learn skills is primarily the key. So if that is ultimately our big problem, the question is, how do we transform our systems, education systems, to deliver that? And we really have done a lot of work on this, both on which ideas and models might be effective in transforming education systems. And this is the work on innovations, and it fits under the sourcing bucket, which is finding those models and ideas and innovations that could be helpful. The second one is, after you find those, you really need to support those ideas to go across a system. So that's the change management process in a system. This is not necessarily sexy work supporting. It entails changing incentive structures and budget lines and ways of doing everyday business. And the last is to sustain the change. You need demand from communities, from parents. You need political buy-in, and that sustaining piece is really important too. So I'm going to talk to you probably a little bit about all of these, but mainly about the innovations piece, the sourcing piece. But we work across all three. So the question is, you have this 100-year gap, you have COVID, you have this crisis. Like, how do you close the 100-year gap, which is now much bigger? Maybe it's a 150-year gap because of COVID. And we came up with this idea of leapfrogging. We actually were inspired by all the innovation coming out of Africa, looking at M-Pesa from Kenya, that is mobile, banking, changed the face of banking across the globe. I think Africa is actually on the forefront of innovation. And, can you think about leapfrogging in education, and what would it look like? So leapfrogging, there's no one term. It could mean jumping ahead or skipping steps or bypassing legacy infrastructure, which would mean schools. So in the telecommunications world, everybody's using mobile phones. Nobody's laying copper wire for landlines. That's bypassing legacy infrastructure. We don't think that's the way to go for education, because it would mean bypassing schools altogether. And we've just spent so many years building schools and getting kids into them. Let's just transform how and what they do and how they sit in a community ecosystem. So when we talk about leapfrogging, we're really talking about system transformation and rapid nonlinear progress. We took a look at education innovations from around the globe, and I'm happy to share any of this data from this global catalog on education innovations if anybody would like. The dark blue countries are where there's a lot of innovation. This was just a snapshot. It is by no means a full census of all the innovations out there, but we used it to think about how could education innovations be harnessed for systems change? What could government policymakers take from innovations around the world? And we found that there's lots of innovation happening everywhere, and COVID has changed some of the trends. One is, before COVID, we found that innovation was largely at the margins of education systems. It was in maybe state ministries, it was in hard to reach areas, it was with public-private partnerships, it was with nonprofit organizations, etc. But because of COVID and everybody had to close their schools, all of a sudden education systems had to innovate, and innovation has been right at the center with this, search for remote learning amid the COVID crisis. And it shows education systems can innovate. Absolutely, they can, and they did. The other thing that we see coming out of COVID is that there's lots of new education allies, and it's a real opportunity for government policymakers and those that work closely with government and supporting delivery of education services to think about, outside the school walls, all the education allies that can be tapped to help children learn. And that includes parents, There's I think one of the lasting things that we see great lessons from Botswana and India, for example, where parents were given SMS messages with problems not on smartphones, and kids' numeracy actually improved over the course of COVID. And they would call parents and they would have ask their kids to be put on, their moms to put, and parents to put kids on speakerphones, and the kids would talk, the teachers would talk through the problems. So there's all sorts of creative ways it's not a substitute for school, but to help augment and power up learning. And I think this is really important to think through as we think about departure from the traditional pathway of thinking about educational progress. So before COVID, not in leapfrogging times, this is the normal way in which education systems have expanded. They expanded in my country, the United States, this way. They expanded in most of the developing world this way. First, it was build schools, make them free, get kids into school, expansion, access. And we saw that in the Millennium Development Goals. Then there was a growing recognition that without concomitant focus on teacher quality and teaching learning materials, kids could be in school, but they might not be learning much, particularly in the early grades around literacy and numeracy. We see the big push for early grade reading, early grade math, etc., as foundational skills that kids need to build on for further educational trajectories. And then in systems where access and quality, basic academic quality are met, everyone is talking about relevance. Are the kids learning the skills they need to learn to succeed in the world of work in the 21st century, for example? And this stepwise process of thinking about education transformation is part of what has kept poor communities poor and rich communities rich, because the kids who get the 21st century skills they need and really relevant education are going to go on and do much better. So we started playing with the idea of a leapfrog pathway, changing this up. What would it look like? What's a pathway that systems, government actors could think about and use as a tool to sort of diagnose where they're at and think about how they would move forward if you want to try to do a leapfrog approach. And basically, we said you need to do all access, quality, and relevance all at the same time. Now, that sounds super duper difficult. I've had many an argument with people in my sector and my colleagues saying, no, 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 for the poor kids, just get them to teach literacy. That's key. And then, don't worry about higher order thinking skills. I really disagree. I think it's a lot about how you change. And there was a comment about this, how teachers teach. It's a lot about the switch and teaching style. You can learn literacy, you can learn science at the same time as developing teamwork skills, which employers often want if you use, interactive group work, for example, and kids get the habit of developing that. So we developed this leapfrog pathway. I'm going to talk through it briefly and then end. And it was basically based on all the evidence we know about how to transform systems so you can get academic and 21st century skills. So we did a literature review, and it looked at all the innovations, what's coming on the horizon, what the possibility is, and through a large number of interviews. So I'm going to breeze through these slides very quickly. It's not for you to read every fine print, but just so you're familiar, and I can send follow-up information in the tools if it's useful. The first is that it depends on where you're starting, it depends on your jurisdiction, and it depends on your system that you're delivering education in, but it's a bit of a diagnostic tool. Is your system largely lecture-based? If so, start moving up the ladder towards a more, where you have some lectures and didactic instruction and more in a combination of more interactive instruction. So that's the teaching and learning dimension, which is essential. The other piece, which is also essential, we think, for leapfrogging, and again, it depends on your starting point, is around recognition of learning. When we talk about predetermined, it's really the age group cohort. All 8-year-olds are in this level or grade, and when they finish, they go on to the next grade. If that's where your starting point, you can start moving up towards within grade, sort of group-based differentiated instruction, and letting kids who need more time, taking the time they need to learn the material, and those who are more advanced, getting a little more advanced within grade. But really what we want to do is move towards more individualized progression of how kids move through an education system, and use the employers, whether it's business or faith-based group or whoever in the community is receiving young people to certify their talents. I want to give you an example here of Go for Gold in South Africa, which is on this dimension, where it is a public-private partnership between the construction industry and the education system in very poor areas of South Africa, townships. And the construction industry was having to import people for engineering, project foremen, architecture jobs. Meanwhile, there's a huge youth unemployment rate in South Africa. So they paired up and they said, look, at the end of high school, the last year of high school and beyond, and 1 year beyond, to graduate secondary school, the young people will be embedded in a business, and employers mentor them and watch and see what they think their potential is. It doesn't matter their grades. They have to have, of course, a basic level. And if they think they have potential to be a good employee, which 80% of the young people who go through the program do, they pay for their higher education, and then they hire them back for a period of a couple of years. So that's what I mean around innovations and verification, because a lot of the skills that employers were looking at did not show up on academic transcripts. They were soft skills. The other piece I want to talk about is diversifying people and places. The Go for Gold example is a great example of that. Learning can take place with licensed teacher in a school, but also, with employers. And there's many, many examples of this where we're widening the ways in which young people can learn and from whom they can learn. And then this last example is really about harnessing technology and data. And I want to focus on, you've talked a lot about data. I'm going to focus on technology here on that side where it talks about substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition, and give an example. And then I'll close here. We say you don't absolutely have to have technology in a given context to leapfrog, but because of the scale of the problem, and I would put Nigeria in here, you absolutely need to harness technology for scaling purposes. And the way you want to harness technology is not to substitute for an analog function, something you can do for paper and pencil. And you could use it to augment. So what you really want to do is use it to modify and redefine. And I'll give you two examples. One version is substitution, possibly augmentation, where you get a tablet and you have math problems. Now, if it's just a tablet in school, instead of a piece of paper with math problems, you haven't done anything really to change the children's learning or to rapidly, you might have saved some trees or something. Augmentation can be helpful, can save teachers time, or you can start thinking about out of school practice, which does have is really modifying and redefining what's possible. And I want to give you this example from Brazil, the government of Brazil, of a very rural state with very fewly populated small villages far away from each other, did not have enough secondary education teachers to give kids in this state high school, secondary education. So what they did is they picked the best teachers in the state, put them in the television station of the state, and put in the villages two-way video uplink, sat phones, little TVs, and a teacher that was not qualified to teach secondary but could do classroom management, and had two-way video uplink classes for several years. And this program has been going for 10 years, and those kids took on the National Brazilian Assessment, those kids who had never had any secondary education performed equally as well as everybody else. So again, that's a real example of sort of modifying and redefining what's possible. So I'll stop here. Here's the whole pathway. I just want to put that out there as a tool as you think about what are those things amid COVID that might have silver linings for change. And this is a little bit of a diagnostic and a path of travel that one could use. So let me stop sharing. Okay. Is it all back normal now?
Yes, it is. And thank you very much, Rebecca. I think I speak for everyone when I say that that was deeply appreciated. I think that being able to dip into the international context and also being able to reflect on your own learnings from research and the work that you've done in terms of large-scale studies around the world really adds a rich dimension to the conversation and a very practical dimension as well, to the conversation today. You've explained to us, how to prepare to leapfrog, really, and that's exactly, I think, the position, that a COVID-19 shock, puts a country like Nigeria in. Indeed, many countries of the world are thinking exactly the same thing. How exactly are we supposed to leapfrog? How are we supposed to, for example, pivot, from what some might refer to as the analog system of delivering education to more digital system. But I think that there's a lot of nuance around that. And thank you very much for sharing that nuance, because quite a few people, both here on the panel and who are virtual participants to the session and are watching, are policymakers. So thank you so much for that. What I want to do very quickly is give our panelists an opportunity to reflect on your presentation as they prepare to make their own final statements. But your final statements, I would implore you, for those final statements to really be action-based statements. So to be statements that an implementation team can take and sink its teeth into and run with, as we think about, the year 2021, moving into 2030 and the culmination of the SDGs. And so I want to give you a few moments to sink your teeth into that process, and I'll call on each one of us one by one. But before then, I think it's important to take some comments that have also come from those that are watching via YouTube. I think there have been quite a few comments, not very many questions, but quite a few comments I think have been made. One person says, for example, Lagos State has a systematic architecture that can be improved on and perhaps serve as a model for other states in the country. There's also a comment here around the importance of making sure that every state submits their data, and the reality that not all states are conducting the annual school census. I think that speaks to the point we were making earlier on about how do we incentivize states to actually collect data so that data collection becomes cultural to every state. In addition, there's a comment that agrees, with the statement that Generation Z are actually digital gurus, and we must not underscore or undermine the work that is being done to bring them into the digital space. In addition, there are comments here around whether we have data on out-of-school children, the mechanisms around which how do we actually ascertain, the total number of children out of school in the absence of current census data, and whether we have access to the current NAEC data sets. I think that's a huge issue, for us. Do we actually have access to that as people on the outside of government? And there's one more comment around us needing a paradigm shift in our approach to education. We needing to redefine and be conscious of our own philosophy whilst embracing the global trends in all perspectives. So please keep your comments coming, and also if you have any questions, we may be able to take one or two as we prepare to close the session. And now I'm just going to ask you, our distinguished panelists, to just each share with us one big thought that represents an action point that you would like to make as a suggestion as we move forward. This could be pertaining to work that the Federal Ministry of Education needs to begin to do, or perhaps national levels of government, such as the state level or the local government level. I'd also have suggestions for the non-state sector as well. But I think that it's important for us to think about how research is intermingling with practice, and what a shock like the COVID-19 pandemic does for us as a favor to give us an opportunity to do what Rebecca says, which is to look for. So I'm going to start very quickly with Chinenye for your own immediate reflections, which are also action points from this meeting. Chinenye.
Thank you, Rebecca. I wish you had called me last. I need more time to kind of like digest everything that I saw. It was really awesome stuff in that presentation. But you know, Mo, when I think about this, there's two things that come to mind. The first and maybe the most important really is around the question of because I see about 13 or 14 different dimensions of impact for innovation, which Rebecca has structured into these pillars, and I just love that. But the question I know, but there, I think the question I would like to ask her is to use a metaphor. You can take the horse to the water, but you can't force it to drink, right? So in the past, there have been huge and maybe very important efforts at getting the policymakers to make the shift. And we've seen COVID, and you know, a lot of us were rushing through the COVID space, and you know, trying to go through that portal and move the system to where it needs to be, which is away from the past. But what we've seen, particularly around the states, is a rush to go back to the normal, what they consider to be normal, what they're comfortable with, which is really 19th century. The kind of transformation and leapfrog that you're advocating requires a certain level of acceptance and a certain level of acceptance that this is a reality and that what you want and you're comfortable with in the past is just not going to work. But all this incremental stuff about building schools, we will never build the number of classrooms that we require. And every day that passes by, the children are the ones who lose in this process. So why does it take so much? Why is it so difficult for government to? I heard the discussion, for instance, about data. I don't know if you're a part of that conversation. And I'm thinking, so you're counting buildings, but what's in the buildings in terms of infrastructure? What's the state of the buildings that you're counting, and what happens within the building itself? Even if it's a perfect structure, how much teaching and learning is actually going on inside that building? In the same way, you count teachers, but you're not counting attendance. You're not monitoring the quality of the work that the teachers do on a day-to-day basis, and you can't do that because there's no way technology is going to let you do that for the entire country. And so the decision, and then we're talking about an identity system. We already have a digital identity system. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. I feel very strongly that there is a central question. How do we move this big rock in terms of accepting that we cannot go back to the past and that we must go forward? How do you get the horse to drink the water?
So that's a very powerful question. It's a reflection, but it's also a question, and I think it's good. You know, if Rebecca wants to take a stab at that, I think that would be wonderful, and we would take that as, you know, your own reflection on what it is that we need to do as we move forward. Rebecca, did you want to take that question?
Sure. Can you hear me? My video, I believe, is frozen. At least it is on my end. Yes. But can you hear me?
We can hear you.
We can hear you well.
Okay. I think it's a really, really important question. And I would defer to ministry officials because they will have more insight than I about that. But one of the things that we've seen, because I really talked sort of about the sourcing idea, and then there's the supporting and the sustaining piece. And one of the things that we've seen, we have a number of real-time scaling labs across the world, which is basically where there's a goal and, you know, an innovation that needs to be scaled. We act as an advisor and a in real time data collector, and then feeding it back for iteration, sort of an implementation science partner and documenter. And one of the things we've learned is that because education is complicated and has many stakeholders, the first thing to do, and it takes a while and is rarely done, is really a serious discussion with the key stakeholders around the table around what the shared vision is. And that might actually take a little while. People might use the same words, but not mean the same things. But really, you know, what is it we want to achieve? And then the piece that often gets hung up is what is each organization's, each agencies, each, you know, stakeholder group's role in making this happen. So that's a much more sort of sourcing change management piece of like how to get it done. Because I actually find that most government officials and policymakers that we work with want kids to learn, and they want them to learn well. That it is not a lack of desire or ambition that they have on the parts of children. It's how to go about it. And so, you know, we take the leapfrog pathway, we do a bit of a diagnosis, we figure out what innovation is we want to scale, and then it's the teacher unions around the table. It's the finance minister along with the education ministry, and within the education ministry, it's the curriculum people and the assessment people and the teacher training people, right? Who rarely talk to each other and often have, you know, unaligned incentives going down to the classroom, so it's confusing. It's the private sector, it's the nonprofits, it's the parents groups, really having a clear vision of what exactly their role is, like what they should be doing. So that's one thing in the real-time scaling labs process that we found is helpful. If you have, it works in a place where you have people who are committed to helping kids learn and helping them get the skills they need. You know, perhaps your question was, what if there is a lack of ambition on the part of policymakers? There is another approach, and that is, you know, I don't think that's really most cases, to be honest. But if it is the case, what we've seen is that's where you get you have to reverse the three buckets I had. You do a little bit of sustaining political economy work before you can go back up and source the ideas. And that's really, you know, getting movement building and campaigning, getting youth to demand change. We've seen this happen in Latin America highly effectively. Students took to the streets, parents took to the streets. It's really sort of the demand side saying, we want, you know, a really good education that, you know, gives us the skills we need, and we want it now, and you have to do something that forces the horse to come to the water. And the drinking is maybe those steps in the middle, the supporting those change management steps that need to be done. So that would be my quick reflections to that question.
Thank you so much. And I think Rebecca, those are incredibly important reflections. And I think that really hits home with us in Nigeria, given the reality of some of the unrest, you know, that we have faced in the last few weeks, and really does resonate, I think, with everyone who's a Nigerian. Thank you very, very much for that. So I'm going to move on to Mr. Isa Abubakar for your own reflections on a, you know, pragmatic way forward. And that may simply be what you need, you know, within the capacity of ICT, you know, perhaps from the private sector or from other stakeholders.
Please, could you pick somebody else?
Oh, okay. No
Abubakar had to leave.
Let me move on then to Dr. Flora Aderoba. Dr. Flora, are you there for your reflections?
Okay. I've listened to Rebecca. Yeah, she has mentioned some issues. And as a result, I would like to share my experience with UNICEF. Because if we look at the our own sub-thing, it says fostering a culture of innovation in education planning during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. Now we've been talking about innovation in terms of technology. She has raised some issues about the involvement of key stakeholders on the issues of 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 education. And she has given us a picture of what happens at the international level. We have to know that Nigeria has its own peculiarities. And so looking at the peculiarities of Nigeria, we'll be able to find solutions to some of these problems. Now, this issue of deployment of technology in all areas of education is key, and is cost intensive, is capital intensive. So this is why we'll have to look for alternative sources of funding of education. Government alone cannot do it.
And we were just listening to reflections from Dr. Flora Aderogba. And we're going to give them an opportunity to come back and share their own closing reflections. But before they do that, you know, I have some reflections of my own that I have pulled out. And this is really, this is for the benefit of those of us that, you know, remain on the call, but also, in the meeting, but also those that are participating, you know, remotely, because I see that quite a few comments, you know, are coming in. One of the first realities that is stark is the need to convene. The need to convene the critical stakeholders. I think that this is a point that you just made, Rebecca, when you talk about that shared conversation, and whatever mechanism through which we can ensure that that conversation is held is what should be prioritized. So within our context, it may be the movement building, for example, that really does force, you know, that dialogue to happen. And as that begins to happen, then ways by which we can fund the plans that we're beginning to develop can then begin to emerge. As we convene different stakeholders, we can identify the capacity that each of them brings to the table, some of which might be financial capacity. I really, you know, one of the comments that you made that really jumped out, you know, at me is the importance of addressing access, quality, and relevance all at once. I think this approach is one that is critical. Unfortunately, I think a huge part of why we are in the situation where we are, where we have so many children out of school, those in school not learning well, and those that are learning not being able to, you know, access, you know, jobs and have sustainable futures and, you know, access decent work. I think it's really because we have siloed these three dimensions, you know, and so we have said to ourselves, when we get them into school, when we tick that box, then we'll begin to think about what they're learning. And then once we tick that box, we'll begin to think about whether it's relevant to them, you know, in the future. So being able to address all these three at the same time, I think becomes a very important action point, you know, for us within the context of Nigeria. Again, thank you very much for explaining to us, you know, from research, how to prepare to leapfrog, you know, talking about teaching and learning, you know, recognizing learning, and a very important point you make, I think, also about certification being important and valuable. But again, it's really skills that matter. And sometimes, you know, when we think about the soft skills and the world, you know, that we're morphing into, or what it is that the world is morphing into, given all the series of shocks that we've experienced recently, one really does begin to bring into sharp focus, I think, the need to focus on skills, whether or not those skills are measured at the moment, but being able to possess and demonstrate those skills, I think, is really, really important. Again, within the context of Nigeria, where, you know, technical and vocational education really has not received the sort of attention that it should, I think this is important for us to think about as an action point. And then talking about, you know, making sure that data is available, useful, meaningful data. I think there are very, very good suggestions that were made around joined up planning for evidence generation. And, you know, the pragmatism around this is being able to share costs, you know, interagency sharing of costs, inter-institution sharing of costs, and at the same time being able to share that information and share that data, you know, as well. On a very, very practical dimension, there's no reason, for example, why annual school census data, which collects data on teachers and collects data on school infrastructure and resources, cannot be merged with the monitoring learning assessment surveys, so that we actually know how children are doing, and we can do more deeper and more nuanced analysis around, you know, the predictors of learning and the determinants of learning within our school system. I think a big part of what has emerged today is the need for us to realize again that schooling has been disrupted, and going forward, in the next 10 years, we don't even know what school might look like. Many of us who have younger children or even older children have, within the space of just a few months, become teachers, and our homes have become schools, and our laptops, have become, classrooms. So the notion of diverting resources away from brick and mortar and focusing on how we can use it to build deep infrastructure is a very important one. And on a very practical, on an even more practical dimension, is revisiting the mandate of the Tertiary Education Fund to see how we can begin to utilize those funds there for the purpose of providing access to remote learning for young people. And I think one of the final points that I'm really taking away is the notion of management being critical to be infused in national planning. And we are currently, a few of us on this panel are members of the ongoing national development planning exercise. And a simple shock, well, maybe not so simple shock, but a shock that took us all by surprise, national protests really took us back to the drawing board in terms of thinking about how exactly do we plan a future that is uncertain for young people, who are not sat at the table, who are not sat at the planning table. So that certainly seems like an effort in futility. So thinking again about how do we infuse crisis management and the ability to innovate quickly and being able to identify what's working and scale it quickly becomes very important within the context of Nigeria as well. And as well, I think the final point here is, how do we know what success looks like? Being able to measure success, being able to evaluate, being able to work with government and hold them account for the delivery of policy, for the implementation of these strategies, again, is a critical dimension. So on that note, I know I did promise 14:15 to close this meeting. And since our colleagues are not yet back, I think this is a good place to take any final words from our two speakers left on the panel. I don't know, Rebecca, if you have any final words for us, within the Nigerian context, given that we're, in a state of planning at the moment, and we are taking, a lot of suggestions from friends and, organizations that have evidence. If you have any final words from us, and then Chinenye, if you have any closing remarks, and then we will close the meeting.
Wonderful, thank you. I have one final thought that occurred to me as you just spoke. And I cannot opine on the Nigerian context. I leave that for you both, but I will just offer for you some of the lessons we're seeing around the globe from different countries. And that is, especially when you talk of planning, I think we have really, really entered a world where we must embrace wholeheartedly the principles of improvement science and implementation science. Meaning, I think we won't survive. We won't be quick enough. We won't be nimble enough if we think about it as planning very thoughtfully, maybe taking some months or year or more, and then executing the plan. I think we are in a world, because of rapid change in context, where we need to do a plan A, get the best evidence that we can, try the plan A, and have a very, very committed focus on quick data, real-time data feedback, see how it works, tweak it, move to a plan B or a plan A tweaked, and then keep going, do the same thing, real-time data feedback, making sure we know, we collect information from a broad variety of perspectives and move forward that way. I really think that's the only way we'll be able to innovate our way out of COVID in a positive and constructive way. And I actually think it might be a better way of doing business writ large. I mean, we could maybe pilot that methodology. Again, we're learning a lot with these real-time scaling labs, that it actually works quite well. And we started them before COVID. And the ones that had this methodology were able to pivot so quickly in COVID times. And I don't think a world of stability is what's in the future for the next 20, 30 years. I think we're going to, as you guys have said, massive changes in technology, quantum computing, climate shocks, civil unrest, whatever it may be. We need to think that there will be sort of shocks and instability and changes in context for the near future. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that reality check, Rebecca. I think that's much needed and very well appreciated. Thank you. And final words from you, Chinenye?
Well, I will just climb on what Rebecca has said, and I use, because I come from the software world, I'm more familiar with the agile methodology for developing software, which we've also found in education, where you don't have to, the whole world moves towards this thing of fear about fragility. And fragility is an important part of the system. And if you try not to, it's kind of like a bridge. If you make it too rigid, and there should be an earthquake, it breaks. But if you build into it, if you understand that it's a fragile structure and you build into it from the engineering purpose, its ability to actually shift, which is what they do with the earthquake type buildings in places like Japan, which are earthquake prone, they understand that this rigid structure is very fragile. And so how to make it survive is not to make it anti-fragile, but just to build into it the systems, the elements that allow it to adjust. And the big challenge that we would face with this is getting people, because largely governments aren't built that way. They work to, particularly those like ours that have a history of coming out of a command economy and national planning systems and all that sort of stuff, where we kind of like build a 10-year plan and you're like executing against a 10-year plan without enough changing in between. The end result is that we have a system that is afraid to change. And that's why I talked about taking the horse to the water. Everybody's talking about, everybody seems to be, there's this unspoken fear that it will break, that the system will break or the system will collapse. But the reality is that the system has already broken. It's already collapsed. So there's nothing for us to fear. There is a massive opportunity for us to build new. And if we continue out of fear to go in the reverse direction instead of going forward, then we would not only waste a lot of time, we would also waste a lot of money and a lot of resources. And worst of all, the children are the ones who are impacted by not having us embrace the reality of our generation and what we have to do as people who are involved in planning their future. We really we need a lot of boldness, we need a lot of courage, we need to be able to be vulnerable in terms of trying things out. It's not working, you go back and you make it and you change it. But for that to happen, I think there is and I liked what Rebecca said about flipping the model. I don't think that we're going to get to this through any incremental changes. We just have to find a way to ride on top of, like you said, the crisis, don't waste it. We've got to find a way to ride on top of that and build the momentum to force the change to happen, because the system itself is anti-change, particularly this kind of rapid disruptive type of change. We are saying we would rather work towards building schools for the 1 million students who are in university than to think about the other 140 million who may not be getting good education. And we just continue along that path, and it's not taking us anywhere really. So I do think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of positive stuff that needs to be done. I really wonder if there isn't a big discussion to be had around the stakeholder immersion, because when we come there, people start thinking about, well, what's happening to my child? But your child is 1 out of 60 million, and you just have to extricate yourself from the problems of schooling in Lagos and thinking about schooling in Zongwa, or thinking about schooling in Lapai, or schooling in somewhere in Ado-Ekiti. I mean, we can't be thinking within the little comfortable boxes that we are and say, let me solve this problem that is nuclear and close to me. I really like the idea, and I think we need to work aggressively towards that. And I think Eric is already on that path. The transformation will not happen unless we carry the stakeholders along, and it's going to take time. So let's start working now in the midst of the crisis and see what we can do to get that acceleration and a common goal, a shared vision of what the future can look like for our children. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chinenye. And I think that's a great way to end a panel on building how do we foster a culture on innovation. It's wonderful to be able to conclude with, the statement that Rebecca made, which you have echoed, which is, do not waste a good crisis. On that note, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been a participant at this session, and a massive thank you to our speakers, many of whom are currently in absentia, but thank you so much. We're grateful that the technology held up, so that we could finish the session. We continue again tomorrow. And I look very much to seeing as many of you that are able to attend, where we will be condensing all of these action points, making a presentation, and then thinking through what implementation strategies might look like in alignment with other ongoing planning processes at the national and the subnational level. So thank you everyone for participating in this session, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Take care. Bye.
Good evening, everybody. And by way of knowing who I am, my name is Ola. I'm a director with National Business and Technical Examinations Board, NAEC. Though I am not a panelist, but I just made some observations that may be a little bit out of what we're discussing, but for me, is key. We are looking at the future of education in Nigeria. We are looking at what innovation can we bring in order to make it something that when tomorrow we look back, when we are no more there, and when our children record them, they know that yes, this is a country they are proud to say is their own because of the kind of education that they are finding. When the director of ICT was talking, he made mention of something that touched me. You know, I work with examination body, and I've seen children. A child will come out with a result that is A parallel. He has an A in English language. I have a particular case. And I asked that girl to write original copy of this certificate collected by me. She was looking at me. I didn't even know that she did not understand what I was saying. She had that. It's not just that she had the. She has finished her higher diploma. Has served. I was coming to collect that certificate to collect her NYC certificate. Wow. That is the kind of education we are looking at in Nigeria. I am not saying that is what it is, because I would not want to be quoted. But I want to, from the discussion today, we are looking at how do we innovate. As he was talking about data, we cannot rule data out. In fact, I asked him, I said, sir, as we are talking about data, if you enter motor from here going to Kano, I'm from the north. I'm married to Yoruba man, I'm from the north. If you enter motor from here, you are going to Kano. Can you give me the exact number of my children that are standing on the road, holding plates, looking for food? Dr. Adoroba talked about inclusiveness and exclusion. Some of these children are excluded. The ministry, the government is trying, but how much can they do? I pray that the policies were coming up, because year in, year out, when I was a smaller officer, I had the opportunity of following to see very beautiful policies being put together. But when it comes to the point of implementation, I pray that this thing that we are saying is 6 o'clock will not be in vain. That after we come out with the communicate tomorrow, there will be a follow-up and there's something that will come up. But I will say that where I am coming from, the Rebecca, when she talked, she brought a case of South Africa, where they will go and bring engineers. It's so sad that our children that are trained as engineers in Nigeria today go to Julius Berger. They will go bring a technician from Germany to come and control them. It's sad. If you ask who did the POP that is in this house, it's somebody from Cotonou. Yeah. Ask for those in Thailand, it's somebody from where? What is happening to our own system of education? This is a policy we are coming up with policies, we are coming up with innovation. That we have education. Education is not about somebody reading and writing, about functional education. Education that when somebody cannot speak English, I had a student that did our modular trade examination. They gave him enough engine that has been down for more than 5 years. And the move did not go to any regular secondary school. It was ordinary roadside mechanic. And the move fixed that engine, kicked the engine once, and the engine started. At FSTC Orosu, they just brought him in to do that exam. That is the kind of education I am dreaming for Nigeria. How do we bring this kind of education in our planning and send it over? Last week, we are at the House of Representatives. When we wanted to do our presentation, it became a burden to all of them. Government cannot give everybody. I have graduates in my house that don't have jobs. They are, I don't know, they can't do anything. But there are people out there, a tailor, that want to do this dress. This dress is not less than 25,000 if you don't pay any money. How many of them can collect that as salary in a month when they join government? So that is the kind of policy I am thinking. I may be diverting from what we are looking at, but that is what is happening and it's paying me. I want to make a mark before I leave this our ministry, that let us say that for every child in Nigeria that we see on the street, it doesn't need to beg to eat because he has something he or she can lay her hands to do. But when you talk about the issue of technical, the first presenter talked by the just a slight mention of technical and vocational education. He just mentioned it briefly. Please, I want this committee to find, even if it's just one sentence, and make mention of inclusiveness in our. We have been talking about inclusiveness, but don't let us just include those that have the opportunity, those that are out there on the street. If his data is saying we have 10.5 million out of school children, how many joined in that number this year? That is last year number. How many have joined this year? Because we give birth every year, and these children are. So please, even if I've taken us out, I'm sorry, but please, I want a phrase in this policy, this innovation we are talking about, that will take charge of us deviating up from this system of examination malpractice. We are emphasizing certification too much. That is why our children is a do or die. So if we are able to move away from that, I think
also the attitude of our society. This attitude of regarding some jobs as menial. If people tell an average Nigerian to come and do the child, they say, how can I? It's a menial job. But in other countries like the UK and things, they're highly paid for those jobs that we call menial. Yeah.
Actually, who's chairing? No, doctor is here, so
she's an outsider. No, honorable minister is here. Yes. Thank you, my doctor. Honorable minister is here.
I will not get in trouble because of your comments. Madam, I would like to comment first what you said, because actually, I think that in itself is a discussion that should be noted for a much bigger thing. We are 3 years ago went to India for actually what you're talking about, NFQs with the NBT and NUC, what's his name? Yes, Professor Rashid. Everything you've said is actually point on. The problem is, like you've said, an overemphasis on certification. And certification that I hope that people don't take it the wrong way. Certification today that is fairly useless to us.
Yes.
Just because I hold a PhD, full stop. Yeah. So what does that actually mean? If I cannot do what doctor is doing, my thesis is useless. I get it. But we fight over these things because government from the period of colonial times up to now, the emphasis has been get the document so that you can get a government job.
Yes.
That is what has created the image you've seen. And what you just said, that's why we think that menial jobs are not worth it. My mechanic is probably earning more than myself, but we don't think like that. So when we did that trip, and we saw what India was doing, exactly what you said. So instead of saying that, okay, Adamu that can do this magic on this dead engine is not qualified to talk to us. We did a framework so that he can hold a certificate that proves that he can do what you just said. And then he can now come into the mainstream and he gets out of Matthew's database of out of children. Because actually, the reality is, just like you said, why are we counting productive people in out of school?
Welcome, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Welcome, sir. Can you?
Go ahead.
Yes.
The Honorable Minister did not ask me to go ahead.
This is the group on innovation.
Yes.
So the convener, or those who had the floor? Okay,
Online.
So you have
Yes.
floor. Yeah.
Okay. So actually, the discussion was regarding how do you shift this focus from certification into TVET, STEM, and productivity, just like you mentioned. So the reality is Nigeria has to move on from that war on trying to be called doctor, professor, degree holder, and so on to what can you actually do. An example of this, I was discussing just yesterday. The biggest companies in terms of capital and the money they make are Amazon, Facebook, and so on. The budget of Facebook, the earnings of Facebook in 2018 is more than the budget of Nigeria by like twice. Okay, and they are saying that look, we don't need people to have a first degree. We just need someone that can come in and he can program in Python, okay, R, and he or she can prove that he can do it. So the exams, if you wish, are set in a way to allow the person to prove it, not the other way around. Okay, yeah. So that's one. Second, the person doesn't have to come with the previous document saying I went through primary, secondary school. No, can he actually do what he says? And then give him a job. So Google is doing that, Amazon, Facebook, okay? But I'm mentioning companies because if you're talking about productivity, companies are capitalist entities that emphasize efficiency. So they talk about how do we get the best people regardless. So they're going away from the natural model. Take South Korea. South Korea is closing down universities because they discovered that when I went to Seoul 4 years ago, they had like 4 universities on one street, 4. Okay, and so they realized that they really need all of that because they now looked at it and the emphasis is on what you said, TVET. So how do we now roll back this and come back to emphasizing how getting people that can produce microprocessors, electrical engineering in practical terms, not just the theoretical issues. And then when you're doing the theory, how do we now apply it as innovation? So I think what you're saying is very relevant in terms of the Ministry of Education looking at these issues and saying that we're actually going to have to change the outlook by policy. What the FME did fairly recently in terms of the teachers' policy, the improvement. I was joking with ESTRCN, TRCN. I said, okay, now I'm going to go see how I can become a teacher. And he was like, because the point is, the things we want to do have to be incentivized. You have to incentivize for a Nigerian. If you want him to become a mechanic and stop looking at it as a menial thing, then you incentivize. How do you do it? Government makes sure that the certifications that Nigerians are extremely proud of is given to such people. My first problem with that when I got into government was like 25 years ago. We spent, the first meeting I attended, we spent 20 minutes correcting titles. Sorry, you missed my title. I have a PhD right here. With 20 minutes. So this is our way of thinking. I'm not saying we shouldn't respect learning, but we have to put it into context in terms of put your foot where your mouth is. You can do the job. You have the knowledge, you can do the job. Not just, I have the certificate, I have the job. Sorry for taking a lot of time on this. Okay.
Sorry, so that I don't seem to be speaking. My way of introduction, my name is Dr. Mishri from Delta State. One of the previous discussion, during this slide, particularly when the issue of MS came into play, I think that as part of innovation in our planning strategy, there is need to cascade some of these theories into practice and localize them. Madam, I don't know that way together. There's need for us to localize some of our framework. Now, when someone says the population of the out-of-school children, 10.13 million. Now, someone also said, because of the presentation, our problem is data. The simple implication is that half resources, the data from the resources can be correlated. I am thinking that one of the areas we are missing it is taking the focus on the central as against the local. Where is this data actually coming from? Who is doing the work? Because most times, most of our communities, or most of our schools, or most of the states, you come with consultants. The consultants get to places that they can get to and turn out their results. What is the effort being put in by the constituted authority to reach out to some of these mountainous areas, the riverine areas? In Delta State, there are some places, except you are from such community, you can't go for inspection. I don't know if it's applicable in other states. So how does a consultant get there? And what happens if the time frame is you're going to submit your report within 1 week? For you to meet up the deadline, you take up any figure and you go. So I'm advocating, I'm appealing, if there is, we need to include it in our report, or you need to localize our sampling procedures, because that's the only way I think we can get the data that will be imperative for us, that will be very necessary in our planning process. Thank you.
Honorable Minister, sir. In recent times, for data collection, a lot has been done in that regard to ensure that it is done at the local level, not just consultants coming in. And I can attest for NAEC doing that with the states. Even recently, because most of the data they are school-based, they collect data from the school, from the local government, up to the state, which they now collect at the national level to have our digest of statistics of data that we use at the national level. And they even ensure that they have the relevant agencies join them in this collection of data and ensure that they meet global standards, even in sampling and analysis that is done. I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Matthew, is there to maybe add a word or two to ensure that, to let you know that we are already gone ahead of the point you are raising. Your point is quite valid, but we already are going ahead of that.
Yeah, but
even in Delta State, yes.
Thank you very much. I just left the class dealing with teachers, and I've heard what Mohammed has said. You know, what he said is at the root of many of the practices. The reason why you have all this confusion in data and all of this problem is because it pays to have confusion. Anything you see Nigerians doing, that one is the one that is working. That's where the money is. This confusion will continue as long as people make its resources speak. So anywhere you send the money, once there's a mechanism to share money, you know that will continue, right? That's exactly what he has just said. So supposing you just change the paradigm for the entire exercise, I say, well, from next year, we're no longer giving money to UBEC at states. UBEC money is no longer available to states. It is now available only to the number of children who are in school. So and each of the children you have in school must have a NAEC number. And it is brilliant, it can only be paid by card. And that will solve our out of school children on Monday morning. Because even those who don't like you very much go to the bush and look for you. So Mohammed has this detail on head. Right now is that education planners know that where the money is not to bring the children to school. They are not going to make an effort in the direction. They are going to effort to become consultants. That's where the money is. You have to understand, he has explained it, and I thought that we understand what you guys are saying. Thank you very much. Let me go to the next one. Thank
you. So I guess that was
now I understand.
That's the politician being not the politician.
Let me just digress a little. Yeah. You see, when you look at all these challenges faced by the education sector, transport sector, any sector, I blame the civil servant. Sorry. You can see what the Honourable Minister is. I have retired from service. There was a time I sent a file to the council more than 20 times. He will say, no, I will raise it up again. At last, he accepted and sent it to the bill and to approved. Sometimes, like I said, if you have a file that you felt maybe nothing will come, you don't have interest. But if you have interest for this country to move forward, you want to think for the minister. But you want to think for the country.
Exactly.
So, but when you just felt you are just looking for a program or a project that will enrich you, then that is where we also have to revisit this issue of we civil servants. If you do our work, the problem in Nigeria will solve.
Sorry, sir. Please, sorry, the minister just introduced something to our website, and the feeling of scholarship, whatever, and introduce tax. You must have tax and tax certificates. People that have been feeling it before that have money, but now when is it everybody should go and get tax? Yeah. You see in Ekiti, in different places now, people are going to the tax office to go and pay tax now. So tax is now working because of scholarship. So that's exactly what. Because of an initiative. Yes, that's initiative.
I think your example joins what I said earlier.
Yes.
That the point is Nigerians, I am one, so I've said, we do not get out of bed if it's not incentivized. An example is this, the BVN. They announced the BVN for a year. Go and get your BVN. Go and get your BVN. Nobody bothered until they said, okay, the deadline is such and such, and you can't get money out of your account. Come and see rush. Lines from here to see. So the point is, Nigerians need to be incentivized. So the same point goes for education data. Actually, if you don't give the state, the local government, the school, the individual, the incentive to make sure that the data is correct, you will never get it. Doctor, should I correct your PhD with a doctor or not? The point is, what you mentioned is true in the sense that no matter what you do, just like the Honourable Minister said, nothing is going to change that factor until you incentivize it. So that I remember, Matthew, some 4 years ago, you told me about your experience with regards to the correction of data. Look, right now, you can get data by making sure that your app is mobile, and you ask. I remember speaking to Ubeg and said, look, we're doing stuff so that now the person filling the data on the mobile app has to be in the location because the GPS has to be on. I am telling you, Nigerians will find a way around it. Because that's what we do. But if you incentivize it so that the person doesn't have to do that, so that the lady that had parallel A's I like that parallel A's. Is not going to think that it's useful to her to have parallel A's, but to make sure she understands what she's doing.
Exactly.
That's the only way you'll get around it. So just like he mentioned, if education works with NIMS and you can't get your child into school without an NIMSI number, you can't get anything done as a guardian or parent without your NIMSI number, then we have suddenly solved NIMSI's problem and our own. You get it? So all of this has been in discussion actually. I've been going back and forth between the Honorable Minister and the DG NIMSI, and we've been doing that. So, but the reality is, I think the Ministry of Education has to actually understand that in terms of imperative, there is no ministry better placed to incentivize what it wants for Nigerians. Because nobody can do without education. Nobody, you know, when we say out of school, I remember a discussion a long time ago. People thought that, no, the parents don't want their kids to go to school. It's not true. Everybody wants his child to go to school. It's just the situational issue that comes into play. Especially the misunderstanding, you know, when you come from the north and you say, Al-Majiri, this, look, Al-Majiri by definition is a student.
Yes.
You have to understand that.
Yes.
It is simply the coming of the white man destroying the existing system, and then Al-Majiri became a problem. But Al-Majiri means Al-Muhajir, the person going out to search for education. So when did we now suddenly become? So the point is, unless we understand that people want to be educated, and then you incentivize it, we keep going in this vicious cycle until we know that we can now shift the goalposts, just like the Honorable Minister mentioned. I think it's.
Please, I want to ask you your understanding about this initiative that the federal government declared the federal government introduction of review of the salary of teachers, extending their retirement age to 65. What that has to do with
incentivization?
Yes.
Firstly, it is saying that teachers are important. Not just mentioning it on Teachers' Day. It is saying that now teachers are so important, you're shifting the retirement age so that they now retire with judges, correct? Okay. Just by doing that, you've shown their importance. And then you're improving their salary. So now, if I'm going for my university degree, fresh, I'm 17 years old, I'll start looking at who is earning the most money.
Exactly.
And then a teacher comes up, wow, I want to be a teacher. It's an incentive. We're Nigerians. We want incentives. So that is what it does to teaching profession. But then look at the flip side. Nobody can get in unless he's good. But the opposite is presently true. It's when you can't get electrical engineering, you can't get, then you go and
education Yoruba or education whatever.
Start with.
What the other said, I would have prayed that somebody will follow the legal process to get those approval. If it has to go to BEC, it has to go legislatively to amend to BEC, and you give a time frame.
Yes.
Otherwise, before you know, royal regime will go over, and that the thing will.
That's another problem in Nigeria.
So, give it a time frame of maximum 3 months for you to do all necessary changes. If it's going to the that this thing must be completed within 3 months.
When you notice that part of the, I think I was listening to lunch with Ibrahim, and we said usually ministers, when they come in, sometimes depending on their outlook, I told my boss, I said, look, you have a project, but the civil service has a program. So you have to understand.
You give them a budget.
So is it this thing? Yeah.
They don't do it.
So I understand your point.
You find. I'm telling you, even the pastor tell you your work is at stake. If you don't do it, this is true.
Okay. The chairman has pointed out that we should round up. Yes, we have to round up.
I remember
Mr. Matthew.
You just saying that he's a politician, he has time.
Yeah, the issue of data, as we said, cannot be emphasized. The minister said something, we have said something, he said something now. I remember Honorable Minister at Kano NCE, he brought something up, they almost crucified him. They almost crucified him. You know, education is a comparing list. The issue of data, before parameters of education will move out, before 2007, 2009, we plan to collect this data. But the state said this data is coming from us. Why can't we get it? Then that was when the National Policy on Education Management Information System came up. 2007. The National Card in 2009. Now, they are getting this data to the states to do and forward. Immediately, it was not up to now. Most of the states were not. And that came the issue of this orphan and non-orphan states. I remember somebody said, okay, that woman, our convener talked to me, SP. SP worked for 6 years in this country for 5 states. Immediately SP left, those states became orphan. We have to take it. So what I'm trying to say is that most of the things in data issue, as we say, some governors will just say, our education is with me, do my education. Or should say that commission even accused me of that in conference, Jesus NC. Some the one that's brought their money coming from UNICEF. What did they do? Yes. It's
always about money.
What happened? They went and changed the education system. They now have lower primary, upper primary, this and that.
Wow.
And the way you're not final school census, you have to print for primary as one document, JSS as one document, SS, and so on and so forth. So what it means for UNICEF now is to print about 1, 2, 3, 4 for primary alone, different, before others. UNICEF say, we can't do this, so now we do. They call and say, well, you are not running the pattern with the system. That was how, but finally I think they are back now. With that permission, they saw that they cannot have any information. They came back. The same thing. When minister asked that they should make education back instead of being in let it be on this. They said, it was what? They almost told you so. I'm thinking.
Yeah, but I like his position on that.
Yes. Yes. So what I'm trying to say is that every state is not connected. What we know is that, like, the instrument to be used to make sure it is national harmonized. Then the policy, which we are now putting for review, the review is also harmonized. Now, as we have the software, we make it not to expect key in your data. That aspect of now having unique identifier is also part of the thing. But let us count one before.
Yeah, of course.
Don't count one before. That's with the governor in this country, I hope you enjoy his name, with the Bishop of South, the time they are bringing Beza. You know what he did? They used to give us 1.2 million children for primary from that state. All of a sudden, you went to a program like this. Today, now the number of children I have in primary school is 800,000. The news officer started calling me. What did they do? I said, what have happened? You are the one coming to fake to defend it. The same thing about revenue mobilization and fiscal accountability. They allocate money to states via what is your enrollment, what is your size of this and that is the start of the industry. I asked them, how do you do it? They come to us, they collect data, they go to the state, they collect. When they come, it's not the same. This one is like this, this one is like this. I said, what do you do? He said, well, what they do is that they put them together, add them together, and divide by 2. So, but with everybody's cooperation, I think